On Sunday agenda. But first, the horror budget. That's certainly the expectation surrounding the document Wayne Swan will be bringing down 9 days from now. The Treasurer said this week the collapse in government revenues could be more than the $115 billion over 4 years that was predicted in February. He said the global recession means Australians will have to do more, but with far less. And yesterday's Defence White Paper claimed the department would be able to find savings of $20 billion over the next 10 years to fund its planned new arsenal. Well, here to discuss the opposition's reaction to the upcoming budget is the Shadow Finance Minister, Helen Coonan. Helen Coonan, welcome to Sunday Agenda.
Thank you, Helen.
Now, the government released, before we get on to the budget, the government released a very ambitious Defence White Paper yesterday. The question is, can we afford the cost? Something like an estimated $300 billion. According to the Weekend Australian, the government's ambitions will require Australians to accept real growth in spending over the next 2 decades in defence spending. Now, is that something that we will accept?
Well, I mean, what this is predicated on, of course, is a growth in spending that will be locked into the budget of 3%, certainly until 2018. So it has a very big built-in assumption there as to a growth in the defence budget. But the actual white paper, so far as I understand it, is predicated also on the basis that there will be $20 billion in efficiencies that's yet to come out of the Defence Department and the ADF. Now, that is an heroic assumption when you think that just over the last few months we've seen a really quite difficult situation with people not even being paid properly, and the government's complete inability to be able to ensure that our SAS people are paid. But
do you think there's no wastage?
Well, look, it is obviously a department where there can be enormous efficiencies made, but $20 billion, I think, means that either it's incredibly wasteful now, or there's a prediction going forward that a lot can be cut out of that particular budget amount.
Well, in fact, the former Deputy Defence Secretary Paul Dibb, who authored the Labor White Paper back in 1987, he has said the sums in this White Paper just don't add up. He seems to be intimating that it's well thought out, but it's just pie in the sky. Would you agree with that assessment? Well,
one of the issues, I think, with that is that we haven't seen any way in which the government can justify how it's going to pay for it. There was, I think, 1.5 pages in a very, very large document that did go into great detail about, some quite bewildering array of military hardware that's going to be purchased going forward, with absolutely nothing to justify how they'd actually do it. So it may well be that it's just pie in the sky, but we haven't seen any detail. And I think it's getting to the stage where Australians are entitled to ask why we are asked to commit to these very, very large sums with nothing much more than a back-of-the-envelope calculation. We've seen it, for example, with the broadband policy. We've seen it with the stimulus packages, where we've continually asked how they're targeted, only to find out that there's really very little thought that seems to have gone into these enormous amounts, $80 billion spent since the last budget. So it's not really credible for the government to claim that it's the global financial crisis that's driving all of their reactions.
All right, well, since we're talking about the budget now, the financial slowdown, according to the government, has savaged tax receipts to the point where the Treasurer warned state treasurers that revenue over the next 4 years could actually be more than that $115 billion that was forecast in February, all due to the global recession. Now, does that mean that the government won't be able to fund its election promises?
Well, look, there's a spending side to the budget, and I think it's about time that the government acknowledges that they've got to take some responsibility for some very poor decisions that has put additional pressure on the budget. It's not just the collapse in revenue, certainly there's been that. It's not just the pressures from the global financial crisis. Certainly there's been that, where there has been $80 billion spent since the last budget, flung about with very little real impact. We've got 2 stimulus packages that have pretty much come and gone, with short-term aims for them that just haven't met. We haven't had, for example, an arrest in the decline in unemployment. The first stimulus package was supposed to create 75,000 jobs. The second one to support 90,000 jobs. What have we seen? In fact, 154,000 jobs lost.
But do you think more jobs
since October?
Do you think more jobs would have been lost if we didn't have either of those two stimulus packages?
Well, the government hasn't been able to point to one particular job, any sector that's really where jobs have been saved, or any numbers of jobs. So it's trying to prove a negative, saying, well, it would have been worse if we hadn't had it. We do know that the deficit position has been made considerably worse by poorly thought out stimulus packages that simply haven't met the objectives that have been claimed for them.
All right, now do you think we're in the position